November 2019, Cabo Delgado province, Mozambique. For the past few weeks, Islamic militants have been battling with a private military company of Russian origin which had been in country since September. So far, 11 of these Russian nationals have died fighting the jihadists. Another 25 of them had been wounded. About 50 to 60 more of these Russian contractors returned home, unable to cope with the conditions. The original Russian force comprised slightly over 200 men. Within a couple of months, this Russian PMC had lost more than a third of its original strength. Stories of Russian PMCs operating in other African countries have already circulated. These contractors are believed to be part of the Wagner Group, a shadowy private military company controlled by Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, a friend of Vladimir Putin's. Wagner Group is reputed to be a covert military arm of the Kremlin. Why are these Russian mercenaries in Africa? What have they been up to throughout the African continent? The Russians did not just wake up one day and decide to get involved in Africa. During the Cold War, Africa was a battleground between East and West. The US, China, and the Soviet Union engaged in proxy wars, arming and funding various states and armed groups all over Africa. The Soviet KGB maintained a presence in Africa, however, most of their work ended up bearing no fruit. Historian Christopher Andrew wrote in a 2006 book called The World Was Going Our Way that the high hopes of the mid-1970s disintegrated over the next decade. In Angola and Mozambique, Moscow had to confront the intractable problems caused by a combination of civil war and economic mismanagement. Elsewhere in the book, Christopher Andrew writes, even when the center's hopes were highest, however, African postings were unpopular with many, if not most, KGB officers. There were a number of embarrassing cases of alcoholism in African residencies. Although world media attention has been focused on the much more substantial Chinese presence on the continent, Russia's activities in Africa should not be ignored. Since 2018, Russian PMCs have been propping up the Central African Republic's president Faustin-Archange Touadéra, who exercises next to no control outside of the capital Bangui. Interestingly, the arrival of these Russian mercenaries in the CAR coincided with the company linked to Yevgeny Prigozhin being awarded diamond and gold mining licenses. In August of that year, the CAR and Russia signed an agreement under which quote-unquote primarily former military officers from Russia, also called specialists, would train Central African Republic forces. These Russian nationals do not wear uniforms or identifying insignia. In September 2021, UN experts stated that Russian mercenaries in the Central African Republic have maintained a consistent presence on the front lines of that country's civil war since the end of 2020. A 2021 EU document mentioned that, today, most national army units are operating under direct command or supervision by WG Wagner Group mercenaries. It is perhaps unsurprising that an armed organization of questionable legal status is also guilty of human rights violations. Human Rights Watch interviewed 12 Central African locals about an incident in July 2021 in which 12 unarmed men were beaten and executed by armed Russian-speaking men. In 2019, there was another incident involving Russia-linked forces in which 14 men were arbitrarily detained and tortured exclusively by these Russian nationals over the course of 4 days. One of these men recounted how a Russian-speaking soldier cut off one of his fingers, tortured him with a chain, and kicked his teeth out. A panel of UN experts wrote to the UN Security Council in 2021 that received numerous reports of cases of indiscriminate killings against unarmed civilians by Russian instructors. This panel also received reports of the disappearances of those detained by government forces or their Russian instructors. In October of that year, experts from the United Nations said that they were aware of Russian PMCs harassing and threatening peacekeepers, journalists, humanitarian aid workers, and minorities. The Russian presence in Africa is not limited to the Central African Republic. Since 2017, jihadist militants have been waging an insurgency in the province of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. Economically, this insurgency disturbs the flow of foreign investment into Mozambique's natural gas reserves, estimated to be worth billions. In 2019, Russia-linked military contractors arrived in Mozambique. While the specific role these mercenaries played is unclear, local sources stated to CNN that these Russians were not properly equipped for combat in the dense Mozambican jungles and that relations between the Russians and the local forces were strained. A Mozambican soldier told reporters that the Russian PMCs have done nothing to improve the security situation in the area and that Mozambican army units have even refused to cooperate with them. In Libya too, Russia-linked forces have been present. Until 2020, Libya was in a state of civil war. Foreign actors such as Russia and Turkey involved themselves in this civil war. The exact number of Russian contractors in Libya is unknown. However, what is known is that these contractors worked in conjunction with Russian military forces in the area in support of General Khalifa Haftar's fight against the internationally recognized Libyan government. According to a 2020 article by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Wagner Group personnel directed more accurate artillery and mortar fire upon government forces, demoralized the enemy with sniper fire, and facilitated territorial gains by Haftar's forces. U.S. Ambassador to Libya Richard Norland described the Russian operations as a game changer. In Mali, the Kremlin has been able to exploit popular anti-French sentiment. As France has scaled back its military commitments in the Sahel region, Russian PMCs have stepped in to fill the vacuum. The Russian contractors have also taken over former French bases which had been relinquished to the Malian government in December 2021. Russian military transport aircraft have been discovered making trips to Mali and to Libya. In a manner reminiscent of the Frederick Forsyth novel The Dogs of War, Wagner-affiliated geologists and lawyers have been present in Mali, suggesting that Russian PMCs could provide security services to Russian mining companies in the region. Madagascar has also witnessed the presence of Russian military contractors. The contractors arrived there with the purpose of supporting and advising presidential candidates in the 2018 election, along with training and security services. The Russian PMCs possess no background knowledge about Madagascar or relevant experience in political fieldwork. Originally, they planned to support the incumbent president of Madagascar, but then focused their efforts toward at least 5 other candidates, none of whom made it past the early rounds of voting. However, these operatives would go on to support the victor, Andrei Rajoelina. Russian mining operations within Madagascar were greeted with strikes and popular opposition. While the market share of Russian private military companies is still somewhat small, these PMCs allow the Kremlin to exert influence and project force with the cover of plausible deniability. In a similar vein to the PMCs of post-apartheid South Africa, many of the personnel serving in these private military companies are former special forces operators. While the special military operation in Ukraine is a bigger priority to Russian policymakers, Russian activities in Africa should give pause to those in Africa and in the West. What do you guys think? Will Russia expand its footprint in Africa? How will the US and its allies counter Russia's moves on the continent? How will China respond to Russia's activities in Africa? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.